Yeah, do we need a revolution? Hell yeah. Do we need some evolution? Hell yeah.
What is going on, everyone, and welcome to our first ever Part 2 weekly series. We just had so much to talk about with just all the information that's going on with just the national news and President Trump, the debate. But now we're going to be able to really focus in on some really important information around Tarrant County and Fort Worth, starting with Fort Worth ISD going back to school today on Monday, and then as well as just really preparing for an important election. So we had the honor to really get Professor Max Krochmal, an American historian who is a professor at Texas Christian University. He won the Organization of American Historians Frederick Jackson Turner Award in 2017 for his book, Blue Texas, The Making of a Multiracial Democratic Coalition in a Civil Rights Era. Really excited to have him on and really getting his take. He's been living in Tarrant County for 10 years and has a good perspective. And so let's get to the part 2 of this episode, and I guaranteed what he has to say about the upcoming mayoral election and also the kind of scary news about COVID-19 at TCU really makes this something you want to hear all the way through.
So I'm Max Krochmal. I'm a professor in the history department at TCU and in comparative race and ethnic studies.
You wrote an editorial for Fort Worth Weekly recently, right before the last meeting surrounding the vote for going back to school. Can you walk us through what your motivation was for writing the editorial, as well as what were maybe the 2 or 3 biggest points that you wanted to get across before that vote happened and before we go back to schools on the 5th?
Sure. I wrote the op-ed. It actually started out as an email to a board member, right? I've been involved with the school district for several years, very closely. I have kids in the school district. My wife works in the district, and I work on the district's racial equity committee. And so I had started out by just wanting to get in touch with one of the board members and just offer some ideas and support. And then once I typed this long email, I said, "Oh, this is an op-ed," and so I fired it off. And I think for me, obviously, I wanted the district to postpone the return to in-person learning as long as possible, and to really take an aggressive position in terms of exploring virtual learning and trying to keep our kids safe as long as they could. I wanted to make a couple other points. One was having to do with how decision-making is usually done in Fort Worth and in the schools as no exception, which is to say that wealthy white elites often dominate discussion and get what they want. And that happens both consciously and unconsciously, I think, among policymakers and administrators of our local governments and other large organizations, that they just defer to what, the most elite white folks in town want. And then, I think, so that was another point. I heard you all on your podcast last time, right? Talking a little bit about the mayor and her letter. It was very clear that the elites of Fort Worth wanted schools open. And one point I wanted to make was that, what's right for them and what they want isn't necessarily good for the rest of us. And specifically that their need to reopen business and the economy, whether that's political or financial, is not a good enough reason to put a bunch of Black and brown families at risk. So that, and then I guess the last point I was trying to make was that a bunch of the arguments being made by the return to school crowd were spurious, they were statistically unsound, and they were often extremely paternalistic and even racist. And I wanted to call that out.
Yeah, I mean, I think the article is incredibly well written. I remember reading it and just being really fired up at how poignantly and bluntly you were stating a lot of those things. For you personally, being a TCU professor, are you still holding all of your classes remotely, or what does that look like for you right now?
Yes, I'm 100% remote, which, is difficult. It's not the best way for people to learn, but, I think it was important to me that TCU, again, act in a way that was responsible for our students and for our faculty and staff and for public health. and that we offer virtual classes and have that as an option. And then, for me personally, I'm trying to minimize the risk in my household. And so I wanted to teach online if I could. And also, I'm also watching my kids full time. So I'm very busy. But yeah, no, thank you for the compliments. I think often you guys are both from Fort Worth, right? I've only been here a decade now, not quite. And, I think there's just a lot that happens here that people take as being the normal way of doing business, right? Just this is how Fort Worth works. It's the Fort Worth way, right? And, I'm in a position, I guess, as a relative newcomer to the city and as somebody that, has a certain degree of, independence to be able to say what I see. And as a scholar, right, what I always see is that this very small group of people get to determine outcomes for everybody else. So I wasn't trying to change the subject, but just to point that out, right? And so for TCU, it's the same story. It's actually some of the same people, right, that call the shots at our institution. And they very much wanted to go back to school in person 100%. And we on the faculty rose up and said that wasn't going to work for us and for our community. And so they offered the opportunity for people to teach online if that's what we wanted.
Could you give us the update that what you're seeing with Fort Worth ISD on the process of starting on Monday and what you and your family is going to do around all that and what your recommendations are?
Sure. So what I'm seeing right now is that, they added 2 weeks, which they possibly could have done a little more, but it was a great start. And I really appreciate the board majority that voted to, revise their previous decision and extend and give themselves a little more time to adapt and prepare. Of course, the overall situation is that the state and the state leadership and the federal government have really put our school district and schools everywhere in this terrible position, right, of trying to figure out what to do and really having their hands tied, right, being told that if you don't come back, you're not going to get funded. And what that has then done in turn is put parents in a terrible situation of having to make these horrible choices between, do I go to work or do I risk my life? Do I send my kids to school or do I risk their lives and grandma's life? And nobody should be in that situation, right? And if it hadn't been for terrible leadership coming from Trump on down, right, and from Governor Abbott and Attorney General Paxton and others, right, we could actually maybe as a community come together and make some good decisions. But instead we got this boot on our necks, right? And so we're all forced to do what we can with this terrible situation. So for a lot of parents, that means they got to send their kids back to school because their employers are forcing them to come back to work. And, I feel for them. I don't begrudge them anything, right? Again, I think this is a public health, public policy question, right? Rather than it being about what individual families have to do to get by. In my case, I'm able to work from home, so I'm keeping my kids home and I'm going to do that as long as I can. My wife, as I said, works for the schools, and so she'll be back. She's already back in a school working every day, but she's in a role now as an instructional coach. So she works primarily with teachers rather than directly with students. But we're very nervous about just what that will mean in terms of her exposure and what she'll be bringing back home, and that's forcing us to readjust how we've been managing the crisis, with our social networks, with our friends, and so on. So yeah, I worry about it. And then I've also been alerted to the fact that some schools in the district are pushing to reopen even more quickly than the board decision dictated. And I'm very concerned about that some particular parents are finding workarounds to try to pressure their principals into opening sooner. And that's very concerning. But again, it's sort of typical of the pattern, right? That people find a way to get what they want.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an agonizing decision. And, I will say, I think the district is doing everything they can to adapt. But, in our experience, virtual learning has a lot to be desired. and I think having students back in person is actually going to make it that much harder to provide a quality virtual experience for people who choose to stay home. So this is why it isn't just each family choosing what they want, because we all affect each other, right? We're caught in this web of mutuality and you can't escape that. And so I really wish that the district could have found a way to continue improving virtual learning for everybody rather than fooling around with in-person at all. And, perhaps that would have meant having to resist the state dictates more aggressively, but that's a tall ask, right? For any local government, especially one that, is trying to, actually get more resources into the schools and not risk losing what they got.
Yeah. I think that we're all sort of watching with bated breath of what's going to happen over the next few weeks. I want to move us on to TCU. I'm a Horned Frog alum, and being a current professor there, what has been maybe the vibe you have felt from students and fellow faculty members about how things are going on campus at this point? And then also, how do you think that maybe looking forward towards spring semester, do you think that we have the right things in place to make good decisions for next semester?
So regarding public health in particular in COVID, right? So from what I can tell, the numbers have improved some since their initial outbreaks, but I'm not at all convinced those numbers are accurate or comprehensive. We started hearing whispers very early on, after a couple of sororities and fraternities had their entire membership put into quarantine. The word on the street was that they were instructing people to get tested off campus and to not report cases back to the campus authorities. So I'm concerned that that's happening and that people may be using addresses other than their campus addresses when they go and get tests. And what I can say I've directly observed is that, I'm teaching an intro class right now with about 40 students in it, and it's all virtual. But I've had notices on about a dozen of them that have said that, if they were in person, they could not attend, right? Meaning that they've been exposed, they're isolating, they're quarantining something. And I've talked with other colleagues who are teaching, in-person classes, and they have sometimes courses with 4 or 5 students showing up, or even 0, right? And this is a mixture, I think, of people actually being sick, and then also people, I think, sort of giving up on this concurrent, what TCU erroneously calls hybrid education model. And so then, even this past week, there was discussion among students and administrators and the faculty senate that, some students feel like the current model of in-person isn't working. That if they drag themselves out of bed, they get there and they realize a bunch of other students didn't bother. They're at home in their pajamas watching on Zoom, even though they're supposed to be in-person students, right? Yeah. And or they're sick, right? And as a, pedagogically speaking, I still feel for my colleagues who are trying and doing it, because I think it's a real challenge to teach to a room of people and then simultaneously be trying to teach to a computer, right? And to people on Zoom at home. And how do you have a discussion that way? So, I think for me, at least, especially since there was a push for having class synchronously, like during the scheduled times, that it helps me reach all of my students in a more fair, I think, and even manner by having all of us be online. I know that means we still miss out on other things, but for the spring, the plan is to go back. They're again offering faculty the opportunity to choose all virtual, as well as giving students that opportunity. But there's a serious push that just came in Friday to try to get as many people back on campus into classrooms as they can. I will say, I think TCU has handled the public health parts pretty well in terms of trying to adapt the campus. So, in Fort Worth ISD, they've pretty much given up on the idea of social distancing, right? They're going to have students wear masks, but they're keeping everybody with their same teacher in their same classroom. So if 20 kids show up, it's impossible to have social distancing in those rooms. At TCU, in contrast, they actually had a special team of people go around and redefine how every space is going to work during the pandemic, change the room capacities, and it was informed by health experts and kind of technical physical space managers, rather than what's happening in the public schools, which is like, some assistant principal or teachers are trying to figure out how to make it as safe as possible. And that's not really informed by science, right? So I do think TCU is doing that very well. But I think we all wish we could just go back, right? At both levels. We all want this thing to be over. We're all ready for it, right? But that doesn't matter, right? Because it's still there, as we saw, with the president getting sick this week.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of transition to kind of the political scene in Tarrant County. And overall, I know you wrote a full textbook around this. And what is your take on where Tarrant is in the national stage? We were also shared on the debate stage as an example of a Republican city dealing with the crisis as well. So I would love to know your take on just your overview about Tarrant County politics and what potential do we have right now in this election. Do you think it's this election? Do you think it's maybe the next election where you might see the potential of the state of Texas?
Yeah. So of course you're referring to my book, Blue Texas, which it's not so much a textbk as a history, right, of how different. Yeah,
it's like 500 pages. When I see 500 pages, I was like, oh, this thing's massive.
It is a doorstop if you need one. But right, what it explores is how African American, Mexican American civil rights activists, as well as labor and liberal political activists, kind of slowly found each other, right, and from the 1930s into the 1960s, and built a rather robust liberal political alliance, as well as civil rights alliance into the 1960s. And so, that's certainly the frame by which I try to understand a lot of the present, as well as, just being involved in the community whenever I can be. Tarrant County is an exciting crossroads. It is the largest county in America that still elects Republicans, right? Fort Worth is the largest city in America with a Republican mayor. They had to really grasp at straws to try to find cities that had Republican leadership. And the best they could do was Fort Worth and Tulsa, right? Because there aren't very many. We're huge outliers in that sense. So demographically, right, I would say that the people who want the kind of government we currently have are a very small minority in this county and in this city. But they've been fortunate because through a mixture of voter suppression, extreme economic inequality, noblesse oblige, right, all these other factors, they've managed to keep people from the polls. And so in local elections, we haven't gotten much past 9% turnout. Yeah. And that's in the off-year elections. And of course, this year being a presidential year, we're expecting much higher turnout. We have 5 legislative races that cut through Tarrant County that are swing races potentially. And so I think there's a chance the Democrats pick up a couple of those. And I'm particularly watching the race for county sheriff, the push, the candidate Vance Keyes challenging the really terrible, autocratic, racist current incumbent sheriff that needs to go. And Vance Keyes is a very strong candidate. And I think, in this particular cycle has a shot of pulling off a countywide victory. Beto O'Rourke, of course, carried Tarrant County in 2018. Hillary Clinton did not carry Tarrant County, but she did carry the city of Fort Worth in 2016. So, I think this is it's ripe territory for the picking in terms of some minor Democratic gains. I am very concerned that registration numbers statewide are down. And of course, that's due to the pandemic. And again, the systemic suppression of voters in Texas. Texas is an outlier in that we require people to register a month ahead of time, and that we require, everybody has to become a deputized voter registrar in order to register people, and you have to do it county by county. I mean, these are mechanisms designed to keep people from the polls, and they work, right? And then on top of that, we have voter ID. We have, the terrible prosecution of Crystal Mason and Maria Ortega, these people who've been made examples, right, by our vindictive district attorney, Sharon Wilson, right? And they're doing everything they can as a minority within a minority to hang on to power here. And, I hope that people who, haven't participated in politics in a while or, are new to it can understand that this is really a critical turning point potentially. And really, I think an election that comes down to life or death for a lot of people. So hopefully people come out and vote.
Yeah, a lot of the what you're saying about voter suppression also comes on the heels of this week Governor Abbott announcing that each county can only have one drop-off point for mail-in ballots. Do you have any advice for people in this election on how to vote safely? I think that there's a lot of really just uncertainty around like who's going to be at the polls in what sort of attire with what around their waist or across their back. Do you have any advice for people on bucking that trend of voter suppression and voting safely come November?
Yeah, I mean, those are great points and a great question, right? So Texas, again, has done everything possible to not accommodate any changes with the pandemic, right? Unlike other states, they've refused to expand mail-in voting. Now, as you said, the governor is restricting the number of drop-off centers. Of course, at the federal level, Congress has done everything they could to destroy the United States Postal Service. So it makes mail-in balloting that much harder as well. So yeah, I mean, I would say if you're elderly and you have experience voting by mail, that certainly go ahead and do it and mail your ballot now, right, today, because we have no idea how long they're going to take to come in.
Yeah.
I'd say if you're able to do early, we're going to have early voting as we have in the past, and early voting has become easier in Tarrant County in recent years. You can actually go, early vote at any site, and that's a big help. And then, when it comes to election day, I mean, gosh, I'd say anyone who can vote before election day, do it, right? Election day, it could go a variety of different directions. I'm very concerned about the way in which Trump has encouraged his supporters to display weapons and to otherwise intimidate voters, and particularly voters of color, in this coming election. But as a historian, I would say this, right, that many people don't know, but violence around elections is not unusual in American history, and particularly at these really critical moments, right, in which some of the old systems of tyranny and oppression are being replaced or challenged in fundamental ways. And the best example is probably from the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War, when Southern politics very much was decided through the barrel of a gun, as one of my colleagues has put it. And I think it's not to say that's okay, right? Yeah. But what I think we should know is that in our past, right, the moments when we've had some promise of democracy in American history, the moments when folks of color have stood up and actually demanded and won a seat at the table, they've had to face that intimidation before. They've had to face those guns before, and they found ways to protect themselves, and ultimately also needed the state, the government, to make sure that they were safe. But it really is a life and death matter in this election, right? And it's that way in all kinds of ways, right? Like this COVID thing could drag out a lot longer with bad leadership, right? And it could result in a lot more deaths, as we've seen with bad leadership. We really have one wing of American politics that doesn't believe in the right to be for a lot of folks who live here in the U.S., a lot of people who've lived here for generations, or more recent migrants who are here empowering our economy and our culture in all kinds of important ways. So if people don't find a way to get their vote counted, those trends can get a lot worse, and it could mean literally death or expulsion for a lot of people. And so it's scary, but I'm going to wear a mask, right? I'm going to go to the polls, and I'm hopefully we can find ways to monitor and report any signs of voter intimidation. And even I think people need to organize and go to the polls in groups of more than just themselves. And that's something that people have done historically, to protect themselves. Go with your friends, go all at once. That's one thing people can do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I kind of have my last question kind of around the FBI. Like recently in the Star Telegram, they talked about how the FBI warned North Texas law enforcement of possible increase in anti-government violence, mainly the Boogaloo group who is anti-government and things like that. So I just want to think what I just ask us around your thoughts of how people get their information as a historian, as a researcher. What is some of your advice and maybe challenges you see from people who have to get their information free from free services? They may not have research subscriptions or can afford, academic subscriptions. So what is your advice for people when it comes to getting factual news and staying away from conspiracies and information that gets people riled up enough to maybe even create violence in North Texas?
That's a great question. It's more and more of the media, has struggled financially, right? More of it's been consolidated in a few corporate hands, and right, we have paywall even on the Fort Worth Star Telegram, right? And so people can't go and get news as easily as they should. I would say, if you see a story posted on social media, don't trust it, right? If it's on Facebook or Twitter, certainly don't trust the headline, right? And if you do click on it, you got to figure out who wrote it and where it came from and who's paying for it. I mean, I think there's certain trusted sources that people in our community can depend on, right? There are groups like United Fort Worth, like Community Frontline, that post things on their social media, that I think are consistently reliable, and well-researched sources. For U.S. news, right, it's all restricted after a few articles. I've actually been reading lately The Guardian, which is a free website, and it's based out of the UK, but they have a tremendous amount of coverage in the United States. And it's actually sort of remarkable to get to read how people elsewhere in the world are looking at us, right, and thinking about American politics, right, which is covered extensively. I think there's some good radio shows. There's podcasts like this one. Like there's places to go and have informed conversations as well. But there is a lot of misinformation out there. And I think people have to just try to look at multiple sources, right? If you see something on Facebook and you click through and the article doesn't make a lot of sense, just Google the same story and Google News and try to find a few different reports on it and make sure they're from reputable news organizations. If they're from the New York Times or from Reuters or the Associated Press or, reputable newspapers, or commentators, and not places like, Alex Jones or whoever is making this stuff up, InfoWars, right? But that's, it's tough. And I think, the best answer is, that we say in history, right, is find a lot of different sources and try to put them all together and see where they overlap and make sense.
Yeah. Well, I know we got to go, but you just got me fired up about something that I just want a quick 30-45 second around what's your thoughts of the mayoral upcoming election, any tips or things, or what you would like to see, from that,
in the mayor's race?
Yeah. Next year.
Yeah. I mean, well, I've heard rumors, right? It seems as though Betsy Price may not be running again. And so that should create a more fluid situation. For people who have time on their hands, you can go and look at the campaign finance reports and see exactly who's paying for these campaigns, right? For whatever she says about inclusion, right, Betsy Price has proven herself to not actually represent all of the people in this city. You can see that again in her campaign finance reports of who's paying her bills, but also, right, when citizens come to them and say, we need help, right? When immigrants come to the city council and say, we need help. When Black people come and say, stop killing us, right? Who's actually voting in a way that aligns with the hundreds of community people who are coming out to these meetings? So I think, all up and down the city council, it's going to be very exciting to see, I think, a number of contested races and a number of very strong candidates, I think, challenging some of the folks in the establishment. And I hope that we're able to get some real choice. Some of it will depend on this election, right? I think, again, this November is gonna give us a lot of signs about what might be possible next May. Right. So if Vance Keys gets elected county sheriff and a couple of those Democrats win in the legislative races, I think we'll see, a ton of liberal, progressive Democrats filing for city offices as well. And that could mean that we actually have some strong candidates to choose from. I suppose it could also mean that those votes get chopped up in little ways. But I would say, if somebody's an incumbent, look at their voting records. And at least from my vantage point, we have a lot of work to do at the city council in terms of getting people in there who will actually represent their communities.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for doing this and for your time and the perspective that you bring to TCU in Fort Worth. And thank you to your wife and your family for the sacrifices that you guys are making as she goes back into work. We really appreciate it. And we hope that we'll get to talk again soon. We really enjoyed this.
Yeah, me too. This was a lot of fun, and thanks for doing what you guys are doing. It's a good service for our community, and stay in touch.
Definitely.
Yeah,
We'll do, Max.
Definitely. Thank you.
All right. Cool. Take care.
Take care. So, guys, there you have it. Some real great insight from Professor Krochmal, who just has a great pulse on so many important topics that are really important to our success and molding Fort Worth and Tarrant County as a whole. Hope you enjoyed it. Please, again, if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast, share it with a friend. I truly believe we're creating real content for real leaders, influencers, creatives in Fort Worth who want the best tapped in information to actually make a difference. So enjoy your day, and thank you for listening to the pod.
Retribution. Hell yeah, new solution with some execution. Hell yeah, now do we need some education? Hell yeah, just a little mental elevation. Hell yeah, Martin moved him with the meditation. Hell yeah, but I'm a panther running out of patience. Hell yeah.